freedom and climate change. The background here is that we have a massive international debate about how to best protect the environment, and in particular, how to best protect everyone from major climate change events. So we can talk about how much human beings affect the climate. That's an entire different issue. But if we want to do something about this, well, we need to figure out how best to do it and how to do it with the least damage to the rest of our society. And that's really where debates about freedom come in, because if you look at Greta Thunberg, if you look at the Pope, if you look at a number of members of the UN IPCC, so the UN Organization for Climate Change, they all call for massive increases in government intervention and government control of the economy and essentially also of our personal lives. They argue that this is just inevitable. Otherwise, we're going to die from natural change to our environment. However, there is a smaller group of people who maintain that that's just not the right way to go about it. That is, for example, Nobel Prize winner Paul Romer, who's argued that a free market handles transitions and innovation way better than any government control efforts. And that basic discussion is really about the virtues of freedom and a dynamic economic development versus government control and sort of one size fits all solutions to a main problem. Now, what I'm going to do now is, first of all, introduce you to some of the arguments against freedom, because even if probably most of us are in favor of freedom, both economic freedom and political freedom and so on, we need to know how to engage with the arguments of the opposition. Otherwise, we are going to just end up by saying, well, freedom is great, period. So one of the basic problems today is that economic growth is seen as a threat. The Pope has simply said we need to redistribute because we can't have growth. There's an entire movement internationally for zero growth, a zero growth economy, a zero growth society. And that's because they maintain that growth creates large environmental problems, that growth is associated with, for example, more emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that cause climate change. The main problem here is that they're confused about what economic growth is. Now, for an economist, economic growth can come from two very fundamental mechanisms. Either it comes from factor accumulation. You use more machinery, you use more labor, more people who work more hours, and you use more energy and other resources. So that's by and large the way China has been growing for the last 30 years. But it can also come from productivity development. And productivity development is essentially that you learn how to produce more with fewer resources. Essentially, growth that comes from productivity development is also environmentally friendly because it leaves a smaller footprint on the environment. So growth in itself is not harmful to the climate, because we need to know what kind of growth are we talking about, what kind of basic factors contribute to that growth. And essentially, if you want growth that is also good for the environment, you want basic productivity-based growth. Now, all the way back to the late 1950s, when the economist Robert Solow started really looking and thinking about these things, he found that about 80% of all growth in the world, long-run growth that is actually productivity-based. And once you become a sort of normally middle income or developed economy, your long-run growth is going to be fully based on productivity, not on simply getting more people to work. But for productivity to happen, we need innovation and we need entrepreneurship. It doesn't happen by itself. There is no magic involved here. It's human action. And the big problem is that parts of the arguments against freedom really argue for the opposite. So there are two types of arguments here, Marxist or neo-Marxist arguments, and there are neoclassical economic arguments and arguments based on philosophical justice considerations. These are the arguments against freedom and the argument that people like me and Christian Bjørnskov will have to argue against. Now, the Marxist ones first. The Marxist argument here is that capitalism creates short time horizons. So essentially, their argument is that capitalism and a system of free market enterprise creates short time horizons. So what happens in the future, what's going to happen in 10 years is not taken into account by firms in a capitalist free economy. They also argue that that leads to allocative inefficiency. Basically, allocative inefficiency is a situation where resources are not used where they make most bang for the buck. So the resources are not used in where in the economy they contribute most to economic development. The weird thing is that that's not based on evidence. Even though the European Union, the Commission, is at the moment looking into these kinds of arguments in order to inform their new regulatory framework, there is no actual evidence that capitalism creates short time horizons. But that's the argument. And the argument here, and that's very, very important, the argument against freedom here is based on the fact that, well, it leads to resources not being used where they are most productive. But these Marxists and neo-Marxists do not assess the value of their use in the way that we normally do in economics. Since the 1870s and work by people like Jevons and Menger and Marshall, we've known that value is subjective. And you might value a painting way more than I value that. The painting doesn't have an objective value. It's only our subjective evaluations of its worth that is important. So prices are subjective. They reflect what people are willing to pay for something and not what it's actually worth. But all of these arguments against capitalism here are based on a non-subjective price theory. So actually a type of price theory and value theory that dates back to before 1870. It's what Marx used, but what no one has used for 150 years in economics. What they do is they actually assess the value of something as the costs going into producing it. So if you use a lot of time baking a cake, they would say it's more valuable than if I use much less time baking the same cake, even though they taste the same. That's the problem of objective price theory. That means that if capitalism helps people become more productive, use fewer resources, use less time in producing something, these Marxists will say that it's worth less, that it's less valuable. And of course, then capitalism does create inefficiency because capitalism helps us direct our resources to where we use them most effectively. For example, where we use our labor most effectively. It's simply an upside down world for an economist, but that is at the base of these arguments against a free market system. Secondly, one of the people that who've had the most importance in international discussions of these things in recent years is Mariano Mazzucato, who's an economist based in the UK. Her argument is that innovative firms are really not innovative. That Microsoft is not innovative. That Novo Nordisk is not innovative. Her argument is they don't create value, they just extract value. For her, innovation is something that's created in the public sector. And her claim is that these innovative firms really just steal ideas, inventions from the public sector and use it for their own good. The weird thing here is, of course, that we don't know the value of inventions. And I'm going to come back to that later on. Now, there are other arguments against freedom here, and some of them come from neoclassical economics. So we know that sometimes economic activity results in pollution. You might have a firm upstream who pollutes the water, and you might then have fisheries downstream that suffers from the pollution. And the firm upstream pollutes the water because they don't take into account what happens downstream. We can also sometimes have situations where we overexploit resources. And the neoclassical solution is always taxes and regulation. So for example, a tax on CO2. That can be a very smart thing to do, because if you tax CO2 and you tax it at the correct tax level, then you make the firm behave as if they took into account the fisheries downstream. But this is really used as an argument against a free market economy. Second, Lord Stern, Nicholas Stern, who was actually knighted after he co-authored what's called the Stern Report in 2007 about climate change, claims that intergenerational fairness, being fair towards our children and our children's children and their generation, requires that we place much more value on the future than we actually do. Now we discount less. That's the economic way of saying it. You discount the future less. Now you can see how much we place value on the future by, for example, seeing how much do people save for old age. Stern's argument is that no, that's unfair. He doesn't say it's not economically right. He says it's unfair. So we should actually be forced to think of our children and grandchildren much more than we do today. And his argument that means is that then we can't really emit much more CO2. We have to lower our CO2 emissions dramatically in order to avoid problems that our children and grandchildren might face. It's not an economic argument, but he uses this as an argument against freedom and in favor of having a large state that controls what we are allowed to do and what we are allowed to leave to our children and grandchildren. So those are the arguments that we fight against freedom. The big problem is that there are great arguments in favor of freedom. It's great for us, it's bad for our opponents. And they come basically from two different types of economic and political thinking. One is the so-called Austrian school that has a focus on knowledge and information and how knowledge and information is created. The other is from the so-called public choice school, which has a focus on government action and incentives in politics. And then we have the third, because if you're really in favor of freedom, you have history on your side. And let me start with history. As Christian also said, well, a lot of people have forgotten what the Soviet bloc, the Eastern Bloc was. We have an entire generation right now who's growing up with no actual personal memory of there being a Soviet bloc in any case. And they don't know anything about it. They've never been there, never seen it. Because a town like Prague is a very, very different place today than it was in 1989. So this is the 1992 comparison. It's the first year where we have really good data on CO2 emissions per person in both Eastern and Western Europe. And what I've done is I've taken 3 pairs of countries. They're countries that are neighbors, and they're countries that were almost exactly equally rich prior to World War II. So Finland and Estonia were almost equally rich in the late 1930s. They were both very well-functioning democratic or quasi-democratic societies. Once you get to 1992, right after communism collapsed, you can see the difference. Finland has a long period, 50 years of economic freedom, of democracy, of being a vibrant market economy. Estonia gets 50 years with socialism, with no economic freedom and with no democracy. And right after communism collapses, about 9.5 tons of CO2 is emitted by each Finn. Each Estonian emits almost 16 tons of CO2. And that's despite the fact that at that time, Finland is almost 3 times richer than Estonia. So 50 years of economic freedom in Finland means that they emit way less CO2 while they enjoy a living standard that is way, way higher than Estonia. You can see the same in the pairing between Austria and Czechia. In 1938, Austria and Czechia were almost exactly equally rich. By 1992, and remember, the Czech Republic here has actually been a democracy and has moved much faster than any other country towards a market-free economy from 1989. But still in 1992, there is a massive difference between CO2 emissions in Austria and CO2 emissions in Czechia, even though the Austrians are more than twice as rich as the Czechs. Now, finally, you can see Italy and Slovenia here. Now, you can actually see that CO2 emissions in Slovenia per person are a bit lower than in Italy. There are 2 really good reasons for that. First of all, Slovenia was part of Yugoslavia until the war in 1991. And all the main CO2 emissions from power plants and so on were elsewhere in Yugoslavia. They were not in Slovenia. The other reason is that Italy is one of the countries in Western Europe that in those 50 years after World War II have had the least economic freedom. So basically, once you get these pairings, countries that used to be similar and then had a long period where one was free and the other wasn't free, what you get is a massive difference in CO2 emissions, plus a massive difference in wealth. The West, the free world, is both much wealthier and emits way less CO2. And you can see that also very dramatically in the comparison between Austria and Czechia from 1999 until 2016. Remember that Czechia actually implements a lot of reforms. It becomes a democracy in late 1989. They start implementing market reforms almost immediately. And over the years, what happens to Czechia is it becomes more similar to Austria. It becomes an economy that is much richer. The Czechs are about 80% richer today than in 1990. But their emissions are almost half per person. So that is the effect of introducing a free market economy. So what's going to happen there? Well, the Austrian perspective explains about half. A lot of these things come from innovation. We innovate, we try out new things, we develop new technology, we develop new management practices, we figure out ways where we can actually produce the same, but we use fewer resources, we use less energy. But all innovation requires information. And that's information that the government simply can't have, because innovation comes from trial and error processes. Now, literally thousands of entrepreneurs, thousands of innovators try little things, and in that process, they learn what works and what doesn't work. And you can't learn that without trying. Government doesn't try. So government can't have that kind of information. And it can also not have the information of what's likely to succeed and what's likely to fail. Almost all innovators or inventors believe that their innovation is going to make a difference. But you have to market test it. Remember, value is not something that is objective. Value is something that we assess as free individuals. So once you put up a new product in the market, the only way you can learn about its actual value is test it, see how many people are likely to buy it, how many firms are willing to pay for that product. And the big problem here is, do you want bureaucrats and politicians to decide, or do you want entrepreneurs and companies to decide what, not just what fails and what succeeds, but also what are you going to try out? Essentially, this is information that we know governments simply cannot have. It's logically impossible. The second Austrian perspective here comes from what's known as Hayek's institutional design problem. If you want to regulate, and remember, there are sometimes good reasons why you need to regulate an activity, then you need to know the situation without regulation. You, for example, need to know how much fuel are we burning now? How much are we going to pollute once we're not regulated? Because you have to know what is the situation without regulation to be able to compare with the situation with regulation. Otherwise, you can't know how large the tax you're putting on the company needs to be. You can't know what kind of regulation is actually effective. The big problem here is, once you've introduced the regulation, you no longer have information about what the situation is without regulation. What Hayek realized is that regulatory policy destroys the information that decision makers need to have to know which kind of regulation works. And they might have proper knowledge right now about what regulatory policy works right now. But in 10 years' time, we've had 10 years of innovation, 10 years of change in a free market economy. So what they used to know 10 years ago is now obsolete knowledge. That means that they no longer have any idea whether the regulation they have in place is actually the right one. Basically, most regulation doesn't hit the mark because regulators and decision makers don't know enough to make or implement the right regulations. Now, the other perspective comes from the public choice school. And if you don't know about the public choice school, James Buchanan, who got the Nobel Prize for his work in public choice, sometimes described this as politics without romance. Basically, public choice is the study of politics, the understanding of politics but without assuming that politicians know everything and want everything good for people. We assume that politicians, just as bureaucrats, just as everyone else, have their own incentives. They want to do what's best for themselves. They want to do what's best for their families and friends, and sometimes they want to do what's best for other people. But you can't automatically expect politicians to do the right thing on their own. One of the problems that is well known in public choice is that existing firms in a market are willing to lobby for protection against competition against innovative firms. So essentially, the people who decide regulations, the people who shape environmental policy, have an incentive to protect existing firms and very often protect old technology from competition. What happens is that once you have politicians who listen for some reason to existing firms, either because they try to protect employment, people's jobs in those firms, or because these firms just lobby hard, invite them to a dinner at a nice place and talk to them. Once that kind of situation is in place, actual regulation will very often lock in old technology and prevent innovation. Also, quite paradoxically, if you're a Marxist, you need to know that politicians have short time horizons. It's not capitalism that creates short time horizons, it's politics. For most politicians, the relevant horizon only extends to the next election. Because for politicians, no matter how nice they are, their first incentive is to get re-elected. So they have to do something that makes them look good up until the next election. And what happens after the election is basically irrelevant for most of what they do. That means that very often politicians simply can't plan on a long time horizon. And if you don't plan on a long time horizon, what's the value of something in 10 years' time? Then innovation becomes irrelevant for you. You're simply not going to be interested in effects of innovation because those effects take time. And essentially also what you're going to do is, as a politician, you're going to own government enterprises. Government enterprises typically have what Janusz Kornai called soft budget constraints. So if you have a government enterprise where people don't really want to buy their good anymore, they're going to run a deficit. In a normal private company, in a free market economy, that company will either have to really improve on what they do, or they're going to go bankrupt. A government enterprise gets extra funding. So their budget constraint doesn't really characterize what they're doing. Because, well, if customers leave them and they make a deficit, they know that they're just going to get more funds. And that also means that government enterprises really don't do much innovation, because why should they? They are protected against competition. And once they do innovation or invest some resources in innovation, they very often invest for a much longer time that is necessary. And they end up really keeping investing in ideas, even though those ideas turn out not to be good. Private firms invest, but if the idea that they're investing in turns out not to work, then they have to leave it, because otherwise they go bankrupt. Government research, government innovation doesn't have that break. So if it doesn't work, they throw more resources at the problem. That doesn't make the solution any better. It just means that it's way more expensive than in a private firm. So why do we have this odd debate? Well, it's actually possible for you to find any theoretical arguments for whatever position you hold. If you're Marxist, there are arguments. If you're free market capitalist, there are arguments. If you're social democrat in between, there are arguments. They're all theoretical arguments. A basic determinant of what you believe has to be affected by how much confidence you have in the benevolence and the competence of politicians and bureaucrats. And the big thing here is, if you're looking for how benevolent politicians are, the public choice school really challenges that belief, because 60 years of research in public choice has shown that by and large, politicians are not benevolent. They don't do the right thing. They do the popular thing, and they sometimes do what's best for the interests, the lobbyists and so on who support them. We can't trust politicians to do the right thing. The competence of politicians and of a government-run economy is challenged by the Austrian perspective. The Austrian perspective tells us very clearly that even though you might want government to be innovative, you might want bureaucrats to decide how we're going to solve problems, they simply don't have and they can't have the information and the knowledge that's necessary to solve the problems. So when you look at climate change, essentially you're going to get a number of ideas from governments, from politicians, but they're all going to be basically uninformed ideas, because they're never going to be based on the trial and error process that happens in a free market economy. Quite often we think about the free market economy as something that requires information. We need to know what customers want. We need to know how technology works and so on. But the real thing here is that free market economies create information. It's in a free market economy that you have thousands of firms trying to get ahead, trying to become a little more productive, trying to use a little fewer resources, trying to use a few less man hours on producing the same thing, or trying to produce something that's a little better. And when you have those thousands and thousands of firms all engaged in this trial and error process, you're going to get a situation where the best ideas, the most profitable ideas, and the ideas that people like, they're going to survive. Next year, that information is out there. Next year, we'll know what worked and what didn't work. And that's what next year's innovators, next year's entrepreneurs base their ideas on. And that is a process that cannot work in a government-run economy. A government-run economy simply runs out of innovation. The only way you can make sense of that and not believe in a free market economy is if you have no faith in basic economic insights that we've gathered for the last 250 years. So do we know whether this really works? Yes. Well, one very simple example is air pollution. This is just a snapshot of the Western world, where you have the degree of economic freedom on the x-axis. That's from the Heritage Foundation. And you have air pollution, which is the parts per million content of little particles in the air in large cities in these countries. And it's pretty easy to see in this simple picture that the more economically free your society is, the less you pollute. The the less freedom you have, the more regulated your economy is, the more government runs the show, the more air pollution you get in the large cities. So there is a huge difference here between Copenhagen and Athens, because Greece does not have much economic freedom. You can also see it in different other ways. What I did quite recently was look at CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases. And if we look at the growth in CO2 emissions from 1990 to 2015 across the world, you can see that they have actually grown in countries with the lowest levels of economic freedom. That's a 25% of the world with the lowest levels of economic freedom, with the least degree of market economy. That's where Venezuela is. That's where Cuba is. That's essentially also where a number of formerly communist countries like Kazakhstan are. It's not much better in countries that are sort of low to middle in level freedom. And you can see that CO2 emissions have grown quite a bit in countries that have sort of medium to high levels of economic freedom, that have a fair degree of free market economics. But there is a little trick here. The detail here is that it looks as if medium to high economic freedom is bad if you're really concerned about climate change, if you're really concerned about greenhouse gas emissions. But that group is the group that includes some of the most economically successful poor societies in the world. That would be Malaysia and Indonesia, where millions of people have been raised out of poverty. Countries that have had massive economic growth, massive poverty reduction since 1990. And if you instead look at the most free societies in the world, what you can actually see is that those societies have dramatically reduced their CO2 emissions the last 25 to 30 years. Societies who rest on a free market economy are much more innovative. And over time, their technology becomes cleaner. They use fewer resources. They use much less energy. Essentially, if you're interested in preventing climate change that comes from increased emissions of greenhouse gases, that's where you want your country to end, with a vibrant free market economy. But the way we think about this as economists and political scientists is in terms of what's called a Kuznets curve, an environmental Kuznets curve. Because if you start from being very, very poor, further economic development will increase your emissions. It's unavoidable. The difference is, as you can see in these two curves, if you have a lot of economic freedom, a free market economy that's not regulated, and a free market economy in particular that where private property is really properly protected, then the development actually tops and turns once you hit the income level of around Malaysia. Once a country like Malaysia becomes richer, if it's a free market economy, greenhouse gas emissions actually start to decline, and they start to decline a lot. In the countries that hit the same level, who continue to become a bit richer, but who are not a free market economy, we observe that greenhouse gas emissions just continue to rise. And coming back to my starting point, it's because In the countries that do not have free market economies, growth is based on using more resources, more energy, more people. In the countries that have high economic freedom, growth eventually becomes productivity-based, innovation-based, because that's where the innovation happens. And you can actually see part of that in a fun field. It's airplanes. Now, at the beginning of the 60s, when global travel really reached the masses, normal people could now afford to travel by plane to the US or Mallorca, or wherever they went. Planes emitted a lot of CO2 because they used a lot of jet fuel. But what happens is that companies that are not protected against competition in a free market economy get a very strong incentive to use as little fuel as possible. In particular, after the oil crisis at the beginning of the 1970s, when jet fuel became much more expensive, free market companies really got a strong incentive to save on fuels. So they also demanded planes that could fly further using less fuel. And that's what the free market delivered. Over the years, the innovation that happens in a free market economy has made airplanes much cleaner. They now use very little fuel to transport you to the US once you're allowed to go to the US again. And they therefore also emit way less CO2. So this is only one of literally thousands of examples of how a free market economy forces and incentivizes companies and people to become more environmentally friendly. That doesn't happen if you don't have a free market economy, because if you either do not have any protection of your private property or you don't have any market competition, well, then why would you care? So at the end of the day, what makes freedom superior here is that freedom, and in particular economic freedom, means that we are become good at finding solutions. We use all the information in society because there are thousands of people who generate the information, and there are thousands of people who use the new information. And it's not just bureaucrats and politicians. Freedom frees us from all sorts of ways that democratic politics can and do fail. And freedom makes it profitable to limit emissions, makes it profitable to search for solutions, to use fewer resources, to pollute less. And let me just end by one other thing. We know from a lot of very recent research that freedom also changes us as human beings. That people in free societies, both in politically free and in economically free societies, become more charitable. They think more about their impact on other people. They become less materialistic. They simply become more pro-social. So if you really want to make people more aware of what their actions do to other people, you want an economically and politically free society, not a government-controlled society. Now, if you want to read more here, there are plenty of readings. Matt Ridley's New How Innovation Works is a wonderful introduction to the entire ideas about how does innovation create wealth and solve problems. Terry Anderson and Donald Reel's Free Market Environmentalism is almost 30 years old. It's still a great introduction. And you can find scientific papers. Mine on economic freedom, the CO2 Kuznets curve is out there. A few years ago, Joel Wood and Ian Herzog wrote about economic freedom air quality, where the air quality example is from. And a lot of research is going on right now, all pointing to the basic conclusion today that freedom is a good way to deal with things, both in terms of economic problems and in terms of environmental problems like climate change. It's way superior to any other systems.